good to see you, Jim and John. It's been a while. I don't think we've seen so much facial hair on one screen in a long time. Jim, I think today you've got an interesting demo for us, a little bit of a treat, so I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, it occurred to me that, we talk about how to respond to incidents, and we've talked about various incidents over the years, but we hadn't really gone into a lot of detail on how to do it. So I figured I'd go through a quick demo of a quick response that I did on one of my own personal honeypots in the last week or so. So what I started out with is I've got a web server running on this particular honeypot. It's just a basic Apache web server. And I generate reports every night of various things from the honeypot. And one of the things that I tend to look at when I've got a web server is the user agent strings of the various requests, because that can sometimes, bring to the forefront some suspicious stuff. So this is just a quick excerpt from one of my logs. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just pulling the user agent strings from this access log. In this case, it's from March 31st. And I'm going to sort and unique those. There's not much running on this, but I do have some tools to make sure that the web server stays up and things like that. And so these are the various user agents that tried to connect to my little honeypot here. And one of them that jumped out at me was this hello world. That is not a legitimate user agent string. Most of the rest of these look like they could be actual web browsers or Python scripts. But this hello world one up here got my attention. So decided I want to take a look at what it was that they were trying to do with this. So if I grep for hello world in that access log.
Oh yeah.
Now I see something that looks like a real exploit attempt here. Now it turns out that this /shell looks like it is probably an attempt to exploit JAWS, which is a Java web application framework and content management system. It's been around for a lot of years, had a couple of CVEs in the last year or two. But in this case, we can see that it exposes a shell, and they're CDing into the temp directory, and then removing everything in there, doing a get, and then trying to execute this script. So, among the other things that I might do as soon as I see this is, is this a suspicious web server? And I have installed on this honeypot, I've got a command line tool for interacting with VirusTotal, and you can find this on VirusTotal's web page. And you do need to have an API key to do this, but the free API keys will work just fine. And so if I do that, I discover that this, let me scroll back up here. Probably should have piped this to less. But this IP address where they're trying to download this next stage apparently is in the US. And well,
looks mostly.
Yeah, so let's see if we fgrep for result. Okay, so mostly they see it as clean, but a few show it as being malicious or hosting malware, or they just don't know. Okay, well, let's take this a little further. I did go ahead while this was still up, download that next stage. So let's take a look at that JAWS bash script that they were downloading, and this is now going to attempt to do download a second stage and then execute that and pass it a parameter of JAWS exploit. Okay, that doesn't look so good. So since my honeypot is a 64-bit Intel Linux, I went ahead and downloaded this .i686 version here. And
and each of those is compiled for a different processor, I guess you should probably say.
Yeah, so it's the .x86. Based on the naming, I'm assuming that this is compiled for the 32-bit x86, the .mips for a MIPS processor, ARM, various versions of ARM. So it looks like this malware is one that's going to, scan for these vulnerable web servers, try to inject the payload there, and regardless of which processor it's running on, if it succeeds in downloading this, one of these should successfully actually execute. And so if I run the Linux file command, I see that this is, well, it's actually a 32-bit, even though it says i686. It is statically linked. It is a Linux executable. Okay, so next step then, let's take a look at the strings. And I'm using Didier Stevens' Python strings script because it will extract both ASCII and Unicode strings at once. If I use the built-in Linux strings command, I've got to run it twice to do that. But okay, so let's take a look at the strings here and see if there's anything interesting. And the very first thing I notice is this looks like it might be compressed with UPX. Because if I page on down, there are very few.
Yeah, right there. It's pretty clear.
Very few recognizable strings, except that this is apparently packed with UPX. Now, it turns out UPX is a nice packer in that it is a freely available tool that has a switch that allows you to unpack it. And I happen to have UPX installed on this virtual machine. So if I use the -D switch, we'll see if I can successfully unpack it. I'm going to save the unpacked version with the name of unpacked. And yeah, that unpacked it. Now, actually, before I go any further, I also use my Python script to get signatures for all of the files here, the various hashes. The hash for the log file doesn't really matter, but if I take the SHA-256 hash from either the packed or the unpacked version, I can use my command line VirusTotal tool to search for that. See if we find anything interesting there. And yeah, so there's a Yara rule it's a UPX packed Linux file. Okay. And what is it? Does this tell me anything about the other?
Mirai?
So it's a Mirai variant. Okay, so Mirai variant. Okay, so apparently a lot of antivirus detects the packed version, but if I go ahead and unpack it, let's see if there's anything more interesting there. Let me take the SHA-256 of the unpacked version and see if maybe somebody submitted that one as well.
All right, now I got our Yara.
Okay, so there's another Yara rule here that suggests that there's some XORed stuff. So the string Mozilla. Okay, so let's take a look at the strings both. And I'm just going to save myself a little time by going for longer strings.
Okay.
Okay, so We got some XML stuff here. It looks like it's trying to download some sort of a MIPS executable. And
So
They're looking for Huawei Home Gateway too. That's interesting.
yeah, Huawei Home Gateway, device control. So this looks like this may be attempting to, launch an attack back against the home router potentially from the inside. But that also, it did say that there was an XORed string in there. And another tool that I like here is a tool from Didier Stevens, XOR search. Again, these are all free tools that I'm showing here. Look at the unpacked version. With XOR search, you have to give it some string to look for. And I will often run this with things like HTTP or, EXE. In this case, that Yara rule said that the string Mozilla was XORed here. So, and let me use the -S switch. So if one string is XORed with a certain key, there might be other strings that are XORed with that same key. So by using the -S switch here, it'll save the result if it finds anything. So I can see what other strings might also be XORed with the same key. And sure enough, there are a bunch of them that are XORed with 04. So if I run strings against the again, let me limit this to strings that are at least 10 characters long. So yes, some of this is just noise here. Probably these are probably the strings that were not XORed with anything. But let's see if there's anything else interesting.
Sure, there's a list of passwords there. If you go up again, Jim,
oh yeah.
Yep. So telnet admin, OE Linux 123. The VIZXV one I know I've seen before.
Yeah. So and then down here we've got
possibly a C2 above that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are all good leads to pull on.
And so the unpacked one, one of the things that I could have done, I didn't do it before it disappeared, was to go ahead and try to download this next stage, the MIPS stage here.
And that's probably targeting a specific device because they already know, one, what the payload is, and two, that it's a MIPS device. Because
and the parameter that they pass to it here is this Huawei something. So likely it's targeting some Huawei home gateway device. It's not a device I'm familiar with. We could obviously take this a lot further, but I just wanted to demonstrate how, with a couple of simple tools and some lookups to VirusTotal. Now, it helps that this has already been uploaded to VirusTotal. If it hadn't been, then maybe I would try to do some behavioral analysis, maybe actually run it in a virtual machine that wasn't connected to the internet to see what it tries to do. But I just wanted to demonstrate, if you're paying attention to your logs, you're likely going to detect some attempts like this on a fairly regular basis. And so this is a way that we can try to see what it is that attack is actually attempting to do.
Yeah, I guess it speaks though for the normal people. Don't, like you were saying, you're going to see this all the time, or you see it regularly. Don't run a externally facing web route or a web server. If you're not expecting to see this traffic or don't want to see.
Yeah, it. Right. And I do run some web servers, on my own time. I've got a a personal one for my personal domain, and I run the one for my church. And so I regularly generate reports, nightly or weekly, summarizing the traffic just to keep an eye on things. And I figure most of our viewers, are system administrators or security people in their own enterprises, and some of you may not have a big budget to, pass this off. Have a fully staffed SOC to pass this off to. So I figured I'd show you a couple of simple tools that you can use, to do a quick triage. As I said, clearly I could spend hours going deeper on this, but even in just this few minutes here, there is a fair amount of stuff that you can learn from this. And I thought that might be interesting to some of our viewers.
Definitely. I think one of the things that I had in my head before I started working here was that malware analysis meant that you were going to be pulling up IDA-Pro or Ghidra and getting really down in the weeds on, what exactly commands are being run at a,
down in the weeds, down at the machine level.
Right.
Right. And I absolutely could go load this into Ghidra. In fact, I did. I'm not showing that today. But, Ghidra wasn't able to recognize and rename very many of the functions. And again, I'm not going to spend hours on this because this particular web server wasn't vulnerable to that, but just trying to get an idea for what the attackers are trying to exploit here, I thought it was useful.
For sure. Yeah. And my point being that, like, even if you don't have the Ghidra skills, if you know a couple commands and you know just enough about how malware samples might try to obfuscate things, you can pull out the information that you actually need to know. So let's take a look at this week's internet weather. In particular, we're going to take a look at two ports that jumped up way, way high on the charts. So our first one is port 52869 TCP, which is related to Realtek SDK Miniigd UPnP SOAP. I realize that's a whole mess of soup and letters, but basically, this is a bug that's been around for a while. And I am making the assumption that this is the related bug, but it's a very characteristic port, so I'm fairly confident. And I have a 365-day view here to show that this is not the first time, nor is it the most traffic we've seen on this port. It seems to be periodically scanned by botnets. This vulnerability is fairly old. It's like a 2014 vulnerability specific to the Realtek SDK, and it's UPnP, or Universal Plug and Play, which is something that should really never be exposed to the internet. So, the fact that this is being sought after as a bug means that it's a significant or frequent enough misconfiguration that attackers are going after it. And it does give you, control over the device. The sources in today's or this week's spike are about 400 of them, and they're all at a single ISP in Egypt. This, as you can see from the chart, it's been a significant jump. This has gone up 138 spots to number 9 on our top 10 for most sources scanning. So fairly significant. I don't know exactly what the connection is here with Egypt. Sometimes you might find that a particular group, a particular botnet has a lot of devices, a certain population in a certain part of the world. What that means, hard to say. If it's some sort of dedicated scanning effort, someone rented 400 bots and decided to scan from the same service provider, that's a possibility. What we have also seen in the past is that the devices that get scanned and compromised comprise the future scanning population. So, a bot comes in, breaks into a device, and immediately starts scanning for the same vulnerability they used to infect that device. So it may be that something about this particular ISP in Egypt, they're using a certain device that is vulnerable to this bug. So that's speculation, but it wouldn't be the first time that we've seen something like this happen. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to suggest, is that maybe the vulnerable devices are something that is used a lot in Egypt. a few years back, we had a set of home routers or something, gateways in Brazil that was vulnerable on a specific port, and I can't remember what port it was, but we used to see things like that. So that could very well be what's happening here. I think it's interesting that when was that, September, that we had another spike to almost exactly the same height as where we are now.
Yeah, it is interesting. And
But
I
it looks
wonder
like
if
6 months. It looks like 6 months, right? So 6 months is every 6 months.
Well, that is a little bit too on the nose, right? To me, that suggests that somebody is working off a schedule to try and re-recruit bots with a vulnerability. And it could be a coincidence too, but it is weird that every 6 months or so you get a spike of this traffic.
Well,
So
yeah, it almost looks like a spike that they spike it, and they kind of try it for a little bit, 3 or 4 months, and then they let it go down, and then they spike it again, right? So it's
that the scanning population itself dwindles by being patched or otherwise being taken out of service. So you won't believe this. This is not exactly the same graph, but you can see a massive spike in the last couple of days on port 55555 TCP. Now, we were talking before the show as to what this port might actually be. I think it's likely that it's another UPnP bug, given that the spike occurred at the same time, happens to be 208 sources at an ISP, the same ISP in Egypt. So I believe the same botnet is responsible for this. But there's not a lot of documentation as to what vulnerability this might represent. I did notice that at least 1 or 2 different devices use this port for their UPnP port, but I think there was another software product that happens to use 55555. We had talked briefly about that, and that they do use that. That product was also vulnerable to Log4j. So we have seen that some scanning efforts will scan for a certain port in order to fingerprint, and then during the exploitation phase, connect to a different port on that same box, something like SSH, where maybe they can't reliably fingerprint it based on the SSH, but it's faster to scan the characteristic port and then attack the target port. So this one jumped up to 17th place, a movement of 247 slots. So again, out of nowhere, you start seeing this scanning. This one does not have quite the history that our previous port did. You can see there was some scanning of it earlier this year, but that might have been maybe a precursor or attempt to scan, and then this was the real attack. And this one is a spike that's gone up and then immediately back down again, which is kind of interesting too. Maybe suggesting that the scanning phase was successful, but maybe not the exploitation phase. What do you guys think?
Well, it's a correlation with the same ISP certainly makes it seem related, but it's just this port just has no history. That's tough.
Well, the other possibility is this is the characteristic port, and then the other one was the target port. Maybe. Yeah. I don't have any way to get any closer look at this traffic at this point, but this is the big mystery for the week. So if anybody watching the show does have further information about it, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the show, and I set a couple of my honeypots up to listen on it, and unfortunately in the hour that it's been up, it hasn't caught anything yet, but I will keep looking.
All right. And that's it for the internet weather, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.